Hunter met me at Grangemouth Station, and we went to the docks together. I took a long look at the ship standing there and didn't recognize my verbena. There was now a very strange structure over the rear of the bridge, which looked like a giant pepper pot. It was even taller than the chimney and, to my mind, looked completely out of place on the ship. Moreover, it was not centered on the ship, but was offset to the port side by a good 10 feet. No one knew what it was or what it was for. We were never able to find out anything specific. We were only told that no one at Rosyth shipyards did anything amateurish, and that ships were fitted with what the commanding officer ordered. But there was more to the list than that. On the deck were installed supports for awnings, and on the verbena has already been visited by a master who measured her side by side. I went to Liverpool to see the Chief of Staff of the Western Approaches Fleet. He explained that 6 corvettes from among the adapted for trawling mines to be used for a special mission. We were selected by Commander Crick, the future senior officer of the group. The operation would require radar, and since it was urgent, the radar unit for us would be taken off the Renown. Naturally, I was not satisfied with such scant information, but the Nachstaber did not give me anything more substantial. He said that the less I knew, the better. I objected that people cannot be forbidden to make assumptions, and that the consequence of lack of information will be the emergence of the most improbable rumours. He suggested that we should tell the men that we were to go to the Freetown area. German submarines are appearing more and more frequently in the South Atlantic. They have even been spotted off Ascension Island and in the St. Paul's Rock area off the coast of Brazil. I could not learn anything more. I had to return to the ship. During the trip I cursed more than once the fate that made Commander Crick remember me. If it hadn't been for a long-ago episode with a special train, he would never have remembered I existed. Pressed to choose 6 corvettes, he must have run his eyes over the list and stumbled upon my name. That's the only reason the verbena and I were picked for who knows what. Not that I minded the chance to take part in an unusual operation. I just loved the work we were doing. It was undeniably necessary, important, and worthwhile. How could you think of a more exciting picture than an Atlantic convoy? An armada of ships, held together by the escort ships surrounding it, moving toward home shores. Rolling heavily from side to side, the heavily loaded merchant ships carry in their dark holds food and ammunition for a belligerent Britain. They struggle hard against the waves, cresting and falling into deep troughs, only to find themselves back on the next crest. In a few weeks the same ships will return, but without cargo, and will again cut the dark waters of the Atlantic with their strong forefronts. They would also be tumbling from side to side, but lighter and faster, and from under the stern of one or the other would come the cheerful splashes created by the propellers that were now and then rising above the water. We learned to treat our charges with warmth and love. They were all very different, but we remembered, if not all of them, at least a great many of them. Each ship had its own character, its own personality, just like the escort ships. Often we gave them nicknames. For example, we had Smokin' Joe, a huge ugly steamer that always smoked enormously. Taking the next watch, the new officer was usually interested. How did Smokin' Joe behave? Not too well was the usual reply. Half an hour ago he was blowing the pipes again. I had to teach him a little lesson. But our Smoky Joe can't take it. When you sail beside him for a week, you begin to take a special interest in him. And then, when you see him in the departing convoy, it makes your heart feel warmer. Sometimes you even come closer and greet an old acquaintance, not being lazy to take out the loudspeaker for this purpose. All the more so because you know very well that in a few hours you will get a signal informing you that number 34 is smoking ungodly again, and then your address to him will be far from polite. I have often thought of the men who sailed on those ships. In mid-1941, German submarines were sinking 60 ships every month. In other words, we were losing an entire convoy every month. Nevertheless, there was never a shortage of people wanting to get on these ships. Not a single British vessel was ever delayed in port for want of crew. Can there be a better recommendation for our people? The most daring vessel I have ever seen in my life was nicknamed the Sinbad the Sailor. We first met her in a convoy on the way home. It stood out clearly and I think would have been noticed in any company. From what pile of scrap metal it had been extracted to be made to fight in the worst of the world's wars, no one knew. But Sinbad was very, very old. All the details seemed to strive upward: a straight stem, tall, slender masts, a very tall and surprisingly thin trumpet. Only the stern was narrow and graceful, like a steam yacht. When we first saw it, black smoke was billowing out of the thin chimney. We tried everything: orders, persuasion, flattery, to no avail. Sinbad smoked like a shunting locomotive. And that was just the beginning. A naughty child, he kept falling out of the cradle. Every now and then we'd put him back in. His team reacted to everything with such good humour that it was simply impossible to get seriously angry. When I began to curse into the mouthpiece, the captain of the Sinbad would come to the rail, smile, and wave me off. He was as old and decrepit as his boat. I remember his short, stocky figure with his bowler hat frozen on the bridge. The wind ruthlessly ruffled his fluffy grey-white sideburns, and a good-natured smile never left his broad, weathered face. We all thought that he was not only the captain, but also the owner of this rusty trough. One day the Sinbad was unable to take her place in the marching order. Some malfunction in her worn-out machinery had reduced her speed to such a degree that even a man walking could overtake her. I stayed close by as long as I could. But in the evening I got an emphatic order from Malcolm. Stop babysitting and take your place. I knew the reason for that order. Our convoy was being pursued by 6 German U-boats. I moved closer to the Sinbad. Can you make it go any faster? No, mister. The sound of the wind and the crashing waves drowned out the old man's words. My dinghy was launched 50 years ago. We're in need of some serious repairs. I'm sorry, but I must leave you now. We're expecting an attack on the convoy. Believe me, I'm sorry. Good luck. Don't worry about us, mister. Go back to the convoy. We'll be all right. That night I prayed for the first time in my life. I asked the Almighty not to let the Germans find our old Sinbad. The next morning our long-suffering friend was nowhere to be seen. The only consolation was that not a single SES signal was received during the night. The radio operator kept a constant watch. But 3 weeks later we were escorting several vessels to Liverpool. At this time a convoy was coming out of the River Mersey, with our Sinbad in the middle of it. First we saw a plume of black smoke stretching behind the tall thin tube. Then we laughed amicably when we noticed that the escort corvette had sped up to the intruder. This was an operation he would have to repeat more than once. Having brought our charges to their destination, we approached the Sinbad to exchange a few words. We were genuinely welcome. During the past time on the Sinbad the machinery had been completely overhauled. The ship was as good as new, rejoiced the old captain. Leaving, we hoisted the flag "I wish you good luck" on the Knockrai. In response, a particularly black puff of smoke burst from the long thin chimney and ashes swirled over our deck. To go to sea on this holy trough was to play a risky game with death. But the old captain did it regularly, and apparently had no difficulty in selecting a crew. In my opinion, a man could not be braver, and I did not want to leave him, the brave sailors, and the work I knew, loved, and did well, to set out for parts unknown and for reasons unknown. We moored the Verbena to the side of the Renorna, and from there we had the bulky and complicated radar equipment moved. This gave us a reason to be cocky. How could they take a brand new rig off such a big ship and give it to us? You'd have to be cocky. And I began to think more and more often what kind of operation we were to participate in. For now we were to go to Londonderry and await instructions. Other ships would arrive in the next few days, and a general assembly was scheduled for Friday evening. There were new faces in the crew all the time. I had been involved in training sailors and officers for many years and always enjoyed their professional development. After 6 months at sea, many members of our crew became senior specialists and 2 senior sailors became petty officers. Garda-Marine Edwards, who had presented for a junior lieutenancy, was transferred from us, and his place was taken by Garda-Marine A.D. Townsend. Any member of the crew on the Verbena who wished to promote himself had an opportunity to try his hand. And it did not affect their ability to work. People performed their duties diligently and efficiently, and prepared for examinations in their spare time. Other people took the place of those who had been reassigned. We established good relations with the officer in charge of personnel distribution, and he regularly sent good young men to us. Lt. Whittaker became a lieutenant but stayed with us. Things have changed a great deal since I first took the Verbena to sea 10 months ago. I was the only experienced officer on the ship then. Now I had 3 lieutenants, and all of them had watch certificates. We left Rosyth on Wednesday evening and reached Cape Wrath, the northwestern tip of Scotland, on Thursday afternoon. We had plenty of time to spare. After rounding the headland, we entered the Minch, the strait between the Scottish coast and the Outer Hebrides, and were immediately caught in bad weather. The strong winds carried with them charges of rain. If the rain stopped, it was replaced by mist, only to give way to rain again after a while. However, such weather is common in Minch. I was always surprised how often everywhere else but Minch had fine weather, and the wind raged in the straits. Under such conditions we had only two choices: to lie adrift, or to keep moving forward, but at a slow speed. Either way, we risked being late for Londonderry. That's when I thought of the new radar installation. If it's really as good as they say, it's a sin not to use it. I sent for the operator. Yes, surely it could detect the ground. And we tried it. It was brilliant. I asked the operator if he could work alone for 6 consecutive hours. There were no other specialists of a similar profile on the ship at the time, and receiving an affirmative answer, gave the appropriate orders. I was delighted and humbled by the efficiency of the new installation. And after all, we were travelling down the Minch at full speed. No more fruitless search for a convoy lost in the thick fog. Thanks to this marvellous invention, the life of the escort officers will be much easier. I even forgave the new apparatus its ugly appearance. Exactly 6 hours later we got through the Narrows and approached Londonderry. Everything worked out as planned. The weather in Londonderry didn't spoil either, and knowing when we left Rosyth, no one was expecting us on time. The next few days we were very busy showing off the new toy. Completely unexpectedly, Hunter became seriously ill. He was facing surgery and I was looking for a new senior assistant. The new person didn't need to start from scratch. The main thing was not to destroy what Hunter had done. That wasn't so easy, though. What had been created? Hunter was solid and indestructible. He always worked thoroughly. The captain is often powerless over the problems that arise on a ship. Traditionally, the captain and chief mate should both be first-class officers. In peacetime, they usually are, but in time of war the situation is more complicated. A good captain can have an efficient fighting ship, but without a good chief mate it will not do well. Looking from below, the captain may appear to be some sort of indiscriminate ruling deity, good or not, depending on his character, but in reality his power is very limited. He can only act through a strong officer corps. It is the chief mate who brings to the captain any problems that arise that require supreme intervention. He also informs the crew of the captain's decision. First of all, he must be loyal to his captain, which, however, does not exclude the need and possibility to give timely and tactful advice. He must also be loyal to the team, understand and respect people. This job takes up all of his free time, and he still has responsibilities as an officer of the ship. Soon after Hunter's departure, it became obvious that I could not do without a XO. I went to Londonderry to see the captain, and he promised to send a replacement immediately. 2 days later, on a lovely clear morning, we set out to sea to meet new adventures that awaited us as yet unknown. We knew that we were being sent as an additional escort with the convoy southward, and that we and 5 other specially equipped corvettes would later separate and go on with ships destined for Freetown, Sierra Leone. The convoy consisted of 40 vessels. Compared to the convoys we normally escorted, this was not many. The escort included 6 corvettes and 2 former U.S. Coast Guard cutters. The latter had been received recently under Lend-Lease. They were large, clumsy, and the only thing that made them suitable for use in the escort a large autonomy of navigation. Nevertheless, we gave the convoy quite a solid defence. We set out in a westerly direction at 9 knots and after crossing the 15th meridian turned south. At first nothing happened, and only after reaching the latitude of Brest we were attacked by Focke-Wulfs. They did us no harm, but definitely reported our whereabouts, so I was not at all surprised when the next night one of the convoy ships was torpedoed. The vessel was carrying ammunition and exploded when torpedoed. The rumble of the terrible explosion was heard for miles around. How can one not think of the B-12 group, which did not lose a single one of its wards? And here no one even bothered to organize a search and pursuit of the submarine. We waited for orders, but in vain. The team was prefabricated and unplayed, and there was no senior escort officer. A moderate wind was blowing from the north. It seemed quite evident that the convoy was attacked from behind. Verbena went along the tailwind of the convoy, dropping depth bombs every 500 yards. I don't know if our actions had any effect, but there were no further attacks on the convoy. The next morning it was discovered that one vessel had fallen behind. The Verbena was left to guard it until the sailors finished repairing it. This we did for 12 hours. In that time, the convoy had travelled 108 miles ahead. Although our charge vessel was fast and made 13 knots when repaired, her speed advantage over the convoy was only 4 knots. It took us 22 hours to catch up with the convoy. A day's travel at full speed would significantly deplete our fuel reserves. 2 corvettes had already gone to the Azores for fuel. Once we caught up with the convoy, we were forced to follow. We arrived in the area of Ponta Delgado and found that the port was closed because of the bad weather. We had to drift. We waited all night, but the next day was also inclement, and the next day was no better. The harbour was still closed. Our situation became desperate. We had either to try to enter the harbour or to surrender to the will of the Atlantic and fall prey to the first German submarine. So I decided to take the Verbena into the harbour. The venture was not for the faint of heart. A huge wave picked up the little corvette and carried it toward the entrance. She overtook us a little and rolled a little ahead of us. We moved off her back. And another wave, even bigger than the previous one, was already coming up to the stern. The entrance to the harbour was flying towards us with the speed of a railroad express train. We were surfing, but the board was a corvette weighing 1,200 tons. The wave on which we had started our journey crashed with a rumble against the breakwater, disintegrating into a gigantic fan topped with a halo of fine spray. As soon as the bow of the Verbena was level with the tower at one end of the breakwater, I ordered the rudder to be shifted all the way to the left and given full forward. The ship tilted hard, described a semicircle, and sped into the sheltered bay. Soon the pilot came aboard. He was gesticulating frantically and mumbling something very fast, but I don't know what he was saying because he was speaking Portuguese. A very emotional gentleman. Eventually he ran out of breath and said one sentence in English. "You're a lucky man, sir." "I assure you it's worse out there," I kindly explained. We took fuel, water, sherry, frozen chickens and put to sea at dawn. We were not allowed out during the night. The convoy was now 300 miles ahead. We received the signal, "Join us at once." It was quite evident what had caused this haste. The Admiralty reported that German submarines had been spotted near the convoy. I had to comply, even though it meant increased fuel consumption. 4 days later, when we had almost caught up with the convoy, a new order came: "Your buddy is behind again. Do whatever is necessary." Using radar, we found the lagging ship at night, but repairs were completed in the morning, and by that time the convoy had already moved away from us again by 100 miles. It seemed as if the race would never end. In the afternoon we heard of the separation of the escort ships and part of the convoy destined for Freetown, but we still had half a day's journey ahead of us to get the baby back into the cradle. The next morning we did manage to do so, and with a hasty farewell, set out in search of Freetown. At top speed we consumed twice as much fuel as at low speed, and had been going for a week, the equivalent of a fortnight's passage at 10 knots. We had a long way to go, and I was not at all sure we would make it to the end of it. Especially since we had a problem with the second boiler, we had to go on one. I didn't know what we could count on in Freetown, but I had heard that there was almost nothing there. It seemed unlikely that there would be an ocean tug there for us. And I had no desire to drift with empty tanks on the Atlantic after all. If the cars stop, there will be no electricity, and therefore there will be no radar or ASDIC. I felt that it was better to move, even if very slowly, and people would feel better that way. Few things have such a negative effect on the moral climate in a team as helpless rocking on the waves with stopped cars. As soon as the steady hum of the propeller subsides and the ship, which no longer obeys the rudder, drifts aimlessly, people begin to feel helpless, forgotten. The ship's iron heart stops and your own begins to ache. Surely the worst punishment for a sailor is to be left aboard a ship whose machinery is about to stop. He will have to wander forever on it over the boundless expanse of the ocean. On the basis of the above-mentioned considerations, I outlined a plan of action. We spent an exciting and very productive morning rigging the corvette for sailing. The davits, each 14 feet long, became 2 rails and were secured at a height of 3/4 of the mast. Equipped with cables and hoists, they were at right angles to the mast. They could be adjusted to any desired position. We prepared to place the awning from the quarterdeck on the windward side of the river, and the awning from the bridge on the leeward side. The canopy from the tank, which had a triangular shape, was intended to be a jib. At noon, the mechanic reported that the fuel was at 0. We had to go at least another 4 hours to reach the harbour. We heard on the radio that other corvettes were hunting for a German submarine somewhere south of us, so no one would be able to come up and take us in tow. We requested a tug, and, as I suspected, got the reply that there was no such thing available. There was a rather peculiar smoke rising from the chimney. The stokers were burning the sludge at the bottom of the fuel tanks. The sailors competed in wit and periodically sent messengers to the engine room to find out which of the boilers they had decided to sacrifice and burn to get to port. At last, the peaks surrounding Freetown showed themselves in the distance. Our speed was slowly but steadily dropping. Keeping the anchor ready, we crept into the harbour and dropped it as soon as we found ourselves under the protection of the booms. About an hour later, a small harbour tug came up and pulled us to the tanker. Freetown's anchorage turned out to be quite extensive. If it weren't for the imposing size of the hill overhanging the city, the whole area would have been very reminiscent of the Solent. The red roofs peeking out between the trees on the south side could well have been Lee's village before it had sprawled out. The north shore was an endless marshy plain, with only a green strip of trees visible on the horizon in the distance. A peculiar company had gathered at this anchorage. There were some very unusual landing craft with strange square bows and large ramps, and an assault ship laden with a dozen dinghies. Traditionally, tanker crews were the biggest gossipers in the Navy. They spent much of their time in secluded anchorages where the monotonous flow of life was broken only by the arrival of a new ship in need of fuel. Short-term communication with the crew of the arriving vessel was the only entertainment available to them. That is why tanker crews tastefully passed on the rumours and gossip they knew, and if sometimes they embellished or distorted the facts, at least they were not spreaders of science fiction. It was from the tanker sailors that we learned that the strange ships were amphibians, intended for landing on the French coast of Africa. There could be only one target there, Dakar. It is clear that in such an operation cannot do without corvettes for trawling mines, which will go ahead of the landing ships. Now it was already possible to make more or less reasonable assumptions about the purpose for which before leaving Britain we were loaded with 40 used tyres from some large trucks. We used to think it was a joke. But given our orders to practice deploying trawling equipment without stopping the vehicles, it seemed likely that barges with soldiers would be nailed to our sides on the way to shore. If the 9.2mm guns didn't blow us to smithereens beforehand, radar would help us get to the right spot. The next day I was finally convinced of what I had long suspected. I was not sweating enough to bear the tropical heat. Instead, I was swelling. Bloated. By noon my head was at least 2 sizes larger than my cap, and my boots were hopelessly small. I knew that people who didn't sweat enough were sent home. Something had to be done. I ordered a carpenter's saw and a large log to be brought to me, and after lunch I set to work. By 4 o'clock I had sawed it into small logs, but the sweat was pouring from me in hail. After sweating, I felt much better. In the evening, Commander Crick returned with a group of sea hunters, and we went together to the commander, Admiral Willis. The rumour brought to us by the crew of the tanker proved correct. Our destination was Dakar, but the operation was postponed indefinitely. Until a decision was made as to our fate, we were to do escort work. The landing ship hung around in those waters until the following July, when she was activated for an attack on Madagascar. The Verbena was not involved. She was under repair in Bombay. At Freetown I found myself for the first time in a very piquant situation. Commander Crick had picked a good crew, but without regard to compliance status. Engaged in trawling anchor mines, the ships operate in 2 units. The second most senior officer is the commander of the 2nd unit and carries a heavy load of responsibility. Commander Crick brought in a career officer, a lieutenant commander, believing that he would be the unit commander. Meanwhile, it turned out that he did not have the status of compliance, while all the commanders of corvettes had this status, and I was the senior of them. So I was the one who had the responsibility of the unit commander. I can imagine what the lieutenant commander was going through. In fact, I even sympathized with him. The thing is, although the Western Approaches fleet had long been accustomed to KVDR commanders, we were not considered equals by the career officers. Commander Crick said that he had not been warned of this notorious status, but that he had no objection to Verbena leading the second unit. Nevertheless, I found the situation extremely awkward, as I was not only the second most senior officer, but also the youngest. I went to the Freetown captain. After explaining the situation, I suggested that as long as I was stationed in Freetown, my status should be disregarded. He suggested that I not be fooled. Smiling, he said that he had already heard about the problem from one of my difficult colleagues and told the officer that when his ship became as exemplary as the Verbena, there would be reason to discuss it, but until then he asked me not to bother him. To get out of the awkward situation, and for the reason that we were not being used as minesweepers anyway, I suggested another solution to the problem. I wanted Verbena to separate from the group and go on patrol to the area of St. Paul's Rock, where, as it became known, the German submarines receive fuel and other supplies from specialized submarine tankers, nicknamed cash cows. We could take fuel to Brazil, make another patrol and return to Freetown. Captain Sherbrooke promised to take my suggestion to the commander, but before a reply could be received, information came in about a German submarine sighted south of Freetown. I was ordered to take 3 corvettes under the command of KVR officers and organize her search. We did not find the enemy, but I talked to one of the German submariners by radio telephone, and he almost succeeded in leading me. At that time, some German submarines were equipped with radio telephones operating on the same wavelength as ours, and in addition to each phone was attached to an English-speaking officer. They eavesdropped and even sometimes interfered with our conversations, trying either to find out our plans or at least to confuse us. In the case described, 2 ships each took up position on opposite edges of the area of the submarine's most likely location and began moving toward the center, the spot where it had been sighted. The nicknames of the commanders were used as call signs. My name in these conversations was Ben. When Possum, having heard Ben on the connection, asked about my plans for the future, I could well have given him a detailed scheme of organization of the hunt if the following question had not been asked: what are my geographical coordinates? Possum was working in pair with me. He surely knew where I was, so the question seemed strange to me. At the first opportunity I inquired, using the light signal, if he was asking for my location, and got the answer, no. If we had been able to use light signals all the time, there would probably have been an opportunity to mislead the enemy, but we were out of sight of each other. So I informed the group that there was a German involved in our conversation and suggested that we encode the messages. I believe this was the first time we had ever been tricked in this way. We immediately reported it to the commander. However, the submarine was never detected. It was one of the many cases in which the initial detection and the arrival of the hunting ships were separated by a considerable space of time, making the situation hopeless. We were then ordered to take a fast convoy to the Cape of Good Hope, obtain fuel at Cape Town, and return with a new convoy northward. Our present charges were not like the merchants we were already accustomed to escorting. They were large passenger liners carrying troops intended to reinforce our army in Egypt and the Far East. The speed of the convoy was 15 knots. It was almost our maximum speed. The work turned out to be tense and rather nervous. After all, if we had fallen behind the convoy, we would have had no chance to catch up with it. In addition, we could not perform anti-submarine maneuvers to ensure the safety of protected vessels. An anti-submarine escort is effective only if it has a great speed advantage over a convoy. On December 7th, while en route to Cape Town, we heard of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and on December 9th came the news that Germany and Italy had declared war on America. Now Americans became full participants in the events that were taking place. I can't hide we were pleased to feel that we are no longer alone in this war. And from our experience in the Western Approaches fleet, we knew that this would seriously affect the organization of convoy traffic in the Atlantic. Now we might have a chance to take a number of offensive actions against German submarines. We were anxious with all our hearts to get home and take part in the great events, but instead we had to go farther and farther east for the time being. I was not very keen to return to Freetown, although personally I had nothing to complain about. Here I had become chief officer of a group of 4 combat-ready corvettes, and while we were being used for our intended purpose, that is, anti-submarine work, I felt able to do that work. The escort ships went one after another to get fuel at Port-au-France in French Equatorial Africa. When our turn came, I was very excited at the prospect of visiting a tropical port. My imagination drew me a cosy harbour surrounded by towering trees with vines hanging from heavy branches, on which swing cheerful monkeys, and brightly coloured parrots and huge butterflies flying around. I thought that the charm of the tropics would be even more intensified if it fell on me suddenly, and for this purpose I made appropriate preparations. I located the ship in advance by the morning stars, and then went downstairs to the cabin, ordering the officer of the watch not to call me to the bridge until we were in a tropical paradise. Some time passed, and I was told that land was showing, the lighthouse at the harbour entrance was visible, and according to the radar readings, the shore was not more than a mile away. Do you see any trees? Unfortunately, no, sir. What the hell? I stepped onto the bridge. The land in front of me was bare and desolate and resembled the Berkshire Downs offensively. There were no century-old trees, no monkeys, no parrots. Thus was visited upon me one of the greatest disappointments of my life. We were to get fuel from the pipeline at the dock, but there was still a corvette coming up ahead of us. We didn't start bunkering until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The fuel came by gravity from a large tank on the hill. At this rate, it must have taken at least 4 hours to fill the tanks. We decided to pay a visit to the local governor, who was rumoured to be sympathetic to the Vichy government. The senior aide and I set off on the 2-mile walk to the governor's residence. When we arrived there, we were politely informed that the governor was away, which we doubted, as we saw with our own eyes on the approach to the house how someone bounced from the window. But we had no choice but to reverse course and return to Verbena. We did not take into account one important detail: the suddenness with which the tropical night descends on the land, low to the horizon. But nevertheless bright, the tropical sun disappears from the sky in an instant, and the darkness is impenetrable. The road to the port turned out to be absolutely deserted. We had not yet had time to be enveloped in the dark night, dark as a deadly sin, when we heard a light stomping behind us. Barely had we time to jump back, but we saw an animal the size of a small dog running along the road. We resumed our journey, but very soon we again heard whistling and tapping behind us. It was all very strange and, I admit, frightening. Land crabs. I suggested uncertainly. Do they attack humans, sir? I'll be damned if I know. We stopped. Behind us steadily someone was approaching. I'd feel a little more at ease, so the chief mate admitted pathetically, if they weren't making so much noise. You know, number one, I think we ought to get out of here. Let them think we're cowards, but I can live with that. And we ran, so fast the devil couldn't catch us if he wanted to. Not like some crabs. We escorted the convoy to a given point south of Cape Town and went to Simonstown for fuel. There we were given orders not to return to Freetown, but to stay in Cape Town and wait for further orders. The war in the Pacific was at a critical stage. The Japanese, using carrier-based bomber strike groups, had knocked the American fleet out of Pearl Harbor on December 7th. A few days later we lost the old battleship Ripples and the new battleship Prince of Wales. Except for a few destroyers of the Eastern Fleet, we were the most capable ships of the escort, and there was no doubt that if not today, certainly not tomorrow, we would not be passing eastward. As the senior officer of the corvette group, I was faced with a very serious problem. All the ships needed their boilers cleaned. By the time we arrived, our boilers had already run 1,500 hours. Any movement eastward toward the theatre of war meant adding at least another 500 hours to that figure. In other words, we could not move without cleaning the boilers. I thought it quite obvious that the cleaning should be done in Cape Town, and the sooner the better. But I could accomplish nothing. We were ordered to remain on a 4-hour standby and await orders. And in vain I tried to prove that to keep our ships with hot tube boilers on 4 hours readiness was like sending them to sea, because one boiler had to work all the time. All my arguments were in vain. The ships stood by and added hours to the operational time of the boilers. Thus, waiting for orders, we spent a whole month on 4-hour standby. During that month we were not bored. A special committee set up by the Cape Town authorities took care of entertainment for both officers and sailors. We were the first aliens from the real war to stay in Cape Town for a long time, and the local society ladies competed with each other for the right to have us as guests. A superb American car was placed at my disposal so that I could travel freely in and around the city and to the stables, where magnificent horses were always waiting for us. We even arranged for telephone communication so that a crew could be quickly assembled in case we received orders to go to sea. It was over the telephone that I once received an urgent call. As I approached the telephone, I heard the extremely excited voice of LT Whittaker. He reported that he had dropped overboard the keys to the safe containing classified documents. After checking on the sailors going on leave, he walked on deck and twirled the ring of keys on his finger. From a careless movement, they soared into the air and, flying over the railing, flopped into the water. The dejected lieutenant asked if, as was his custom, he should immediately report the loss to the Admiralty. I told him to do nothing for the present, and hurried to the ship, which was standing in one of the new docks at Cape Town. I knew well that there was a clear sandy bottom there. If we could get a magnet, I thought, we could probably get them. That's when a fresh solution popped into my head. I took all the magnets out of the magnetic compass, tied them together, and in a bunch we began to scour the bottom of the dock. Whittaker and the chief petty officer did not interrupt this activity during the night, while I slept. The next morning I was just finishing breakfast when Whittaker came in, pale and lost. "It's no use," he announced in the tone of a tragic actor. "We'll never find them. We'll have to report them missing and call in the divers." "Keep going," I said, "until I finish my breakfast. If you don't find it, I'll call Simonstown and see if they can help us with a diver." I hadn't finished my second cup of coffee when a glowing Whittaker burst into the cabin, clutching the keys in his wet palm. We'd avoided the red tape after all. Now we had to put the magnets back in place and write off the compass deviation. Fortunately, I still had the notes I had made in preparation for the navigator's exams 9 years ago. With their help, the job was not difficult. The Verbena spent her second Christmas in Simonstown. On Christmas Eve, I sent a request to the supply people for a new dinghy to replace the one we had broken in the Azores storm. At the end of the request I wrote, if our new dinghy has sails and a lowered keel, it would make a great Christmas present. The harbour master replied that there was nothing like that in Simonstown. On Christmas morning, the petty officer helmsman reported the approach of a tug with a new dinghy. It had sails, a lowered keel, and a note tied with a red ribbon, and a puffy bow, "Best wishes from the supply officers, Merry Christmas." Relations between the supply officers and the harbour master's office here were decidedly cool. And then came the long-awaited order: tomorrow morning you are to put to sea, port of destination Singapore. It was January 28th, 1942. The boilers of all the ships had worked 1,500 hours each, the boilers of Verbena 2,000 hours. I refused to go to sea and demanded that this blatant fact was reported to the commander of the Western Approaches Fleet. After all, we were still part of his command. Everyone was trying to use us. No one wanted to take care of us. The conversation with the local high-ranking official was extremely unpleasant. We never came to an agreement, and finally I heard, "All right, but only everything I tell you must remain between us. You will take part in the evacuation of Singapore. You will go to sea?" "Yes, sir," I sighed and left the office. We were just finalizing preparations for going to sea when suddenly our regiment arrived. The 5th Corvette, the Astra, had joined the group. The commander was our new senior officer. Considering the quite insurmountable, in my opinion, difficulties with maintenance, I handed over matters to him with undisguised joy. We obtained fuel in Durban and in Mauritius. Mauritius is a fantastic island. It sits in the very center of the Indian Ocean. Some special crystal transparent atmosphere has formed over this purest of seas, and one can easily see the masts of ships whose hulls remain hidden behind the horizon. In the center of the island rises a series of mountain peaks, resembling the spine of some prehistoric beast, and the dense vegetation covering the hillsides, from a great distance, seems olive-green skin, just as a giant reptile should have. While the ships were bunkering down, the captains and chief mates received an invitation to dinner with the local governor and his charming American wife. Sitting at a long table on the open terrace surrounding the governor's house, it was impossible to imagine that war was just around the corner. I looked at the lavishly dressed ladies and officers in dress uniforms and could not imagine that bombs were already falling and fires were burning nearby. Candle flames were reflected and refracted in crystal candlesticks, casting fanciful shadows on people's faces and clothes. The guests sat on one side of the table. On the other side, behind the illuminated fountain with goldfish rose flooded with the light of spotlights Belvedere, and the background of this charming picture was blue-black sky studded with stars. After dinner there was dancing, and then we returned to the ship. In Durban we were asked to take to Mauritius some soldiers wounded in Africa, who had been waiting for a ship home for a long time without success. We gave our consent. The soldiers turned out to be black, dirty and lousy, but surprisingly pleasant people and interesting conversationalists. From their stories it was clear that the presence of parasites was their misfortune, not their fault. In Colombo we purchased sufficient sulfur candles and profumigated the living quarters so that the damage done by these troublemakers was minimal and short-lived. On February 8, 1942, we left Mauritius. Singapore fell on the 13th, at which time we were south of Ceylon. As there was no change to the orders previously received, Commander Hewitt broke radio silence and requested instructions. The reply came instantly. We were instructed to proceed to Colombo. Commander Hewitt and I paid a visit to Admiral Arbuthnot, the fleet commander in the East Indies. Hewitt was at once taken off the corvette and appointed to take the place of the sloop captain who had fallen ill. He went packing. His XO became captain of the Astra. And I was again faced with the need to establish mutual understanding with the base, where they had never heard of corvettes and had no time to come and get acquainted with them. The base personnel had been in their place before, but under the changed conditions could not cope with the new problems. On arrival we were given a berth suitable only for a vessel half our size. We were to be grounded long before we approached it. Some considered our corvettes to be trawlers, others gave us assignments far beyond our capabilities. New personnel were on their way from England, but their arrival was not expected until May. In the meantime, a few officers were carrying the heavy burden on their shoulders and doing the best they could. Again I spoke of cleaning the boilers. But here, apparently, everyone was convinced that the ships should go until they explode. In March, the Japanese aircraft carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor appeared south of Java, and in the first week of April they struck the convoy from Calcutta. When we arrived in the area, they already had submarines permanently stationed in the Ceylon area. Our job was to organize an escort of convoys from Trincomalee on the east coast around the southern tip of Ceylon to Colombo, and from there to Bombay. For this, and many other jobs, I had at my disposal 4 corvettes and a small Greek destroyer. The Ethos was a delightful little ship. From a distance it looked like the very real D-class destroyer, but in reality it was only a smaller model of the latter and had a displacement of only 600 tons. It had been built before World War I and modernized between the wars. Its crew was tirelessly raring to go into battle, and I had to constantly temper the bursting out of the fighting spirit. One night we were sailing south from Trincomalee and came across a Japanese cruiser. The crew of the Ethos were anxious to engage immediately, but we were escorting a very valuable vessel, a tanker carrying fuel for our battleships off Adu Atoll. I knew that there were no other tankers in the vicinity of Trincomalee, so I firmly rejected the demand from the Ethos. We hastily approached the shore under the protection of the dark hills, while the Verbena took up position between the tanker and the enemy cruiser to create a smoke screen. We delivered our charge safely to our destination, the charming coral atoll of Adu, 600 miles southwest of Colombo. 4 R-class battleships also approached there. While they bunkered, Verbena and Ethos patrolled the harbour entrance. Nothing significant happened, and in the morning the battleships departed for Mombasa. They belonged there, they were all too old to compete with modern Japanese aircraft carriers. We returned to Colombo 3 days before Easter 1942 and were ordered to prepare to clean out the boilers. Half the crew was sent to a rest camp in the mountains. On Saturday evening the boilers were opened, and I went ashore with peace of mind to spend the evening with friends. We were fortunate enough to get into Colombo before the war swept over it. When we first arrived here we were welcomed, as in Cape Town, by a special committee to offer hospitality to sailors. We were inducted into the local society and quickly made friends ashore. Later Colombo was flooded with naval officers, and the little white colony hastened to close up in its shell. In the middle of a very pleasant dinner, I was called to the telephone. Petty Officer Nunes of the signalmen informed me that a general muster had been announced. Excusing myself, I jumped into the rickshaw baby carriage and was very soon on board. Nunes showed me a message: air attack expected tomorrow morning. All ships prepare to repel. It was a little after 9 o'clock in the evening. I gathered all the crew members remaining on board, and for 2 hours we practiced vigorously. We did not have enough men to provide a supply of shells, so we had brought and stacked some shells near the guns in advance. No one knew how many would be needed, but we assumed that the attack would be short. As the Verbena was not parallel to the quay wall, we stretched out a rope to be able to turn the ship and shoot the approaches from the sea. I fell asleep right on the bridge in my camping place. At 6 a.m. we took our battle stations and waited. Nothing was happening. Then we started sending men in batches of 4 to the galley for breakfast. The sun came up. There were thick dark clouds floating south of the city. Apparently that's what the radar picked up. At 8:15 we got the message to let the crew go to breakfast. Nunes brought the message to me. "We've already had breakfast, Nunes," I said, "so the men should be quite happy. We'll wait a little longer, just in case. I'll go to the cabin and get a book." But I didn't get to the cabin in time. As soon as I stepped onto the second gangway, I heard the helicoms on the bridge and the 4-barrel heavy machine guns talking at the same time. By the time I flew up to the bridge, it was all over. But I still managed to see with my own eyes, as the bullets helicon from the port side flew directly into the nose of the Japanese bomber. The Japanese were coming out of the clouds in groups of 3 airplanes. Each group chose a target and attacked simultaneously from 3 directions. We shot down 3 planes. After a short battle, we looked around the anchorage. The old auxiliary cruiser Hector was engulfed in fire. An explosion had damaged the mothership Lucia. The S-class destroyer had sunk with only the tip of her smokestack and bridge visible above the water. The Verbena was the only ship in the anchorage left afloat. The fire from the multi-barrel gun was led by its gunner, and from the helicon, signalman Reeves and the operator of the Azdic. All the planes that attacked us received their share of lead in the forehead. 2 found their end in the water, and the 3rd went down near the Gal Face Hotel. We relayed the report of the destruction of 3 enemy planes and stayed in our seats. What if the enemy returned? An hour later we were called again from the signal tower. Frankly speaking, I expected congratulations and received the following: "Why have I still not received your report on your attendance at the Sunday service on Sunday, March 29th? Nunes' response was so emotional that the signal lamp almost burned out. We were just playing cat and mouse with a Japanese cruiser that Sunday. "You're wrong," Yeoman, I laughed heartily. "Don't you realize that this signal is just so good? It's wonderful. Remember how at home, little notes appeared on the doors of stores destroyed by bombs, business as usual? It's the same here. Life goes on as usual." I didn't really send in the forms, so I was reminded of that. It's impossible to describe what happened to the local population. You had to see it with your own eyes. The train station was attacked by over 100,000 people. The locals didn't want to wait for the Japanese to come. They fled to the mountains, but they had to eat something, and rice was given on cards, which were only bought in their hometown. Hunger and relatives unwilling to share their already meager rice rations slowly but surely brought people back to Colombo. On Easter Day, the Japanese intercepted, attacked and sank the Dorsetshire and Cornwall south of Ceylon. 4 days later, the aircraft carrier Hermes and one of our corvettes Hollycock were sunk off Trincomalee with heavy casualties. Hermes had been with us in January at Simonstown, and we knew the officers well, and the commander of the Hollycock LT, CMDR, T&D, Davis, CWR, was a good friend of mine. The crew members who had been sent to rest were returned to the ship. We were ordered to again close the boilers that had never been cleaned and wait under steam. That same night the chief helmsman knocked on my cabin, where I was talking to the new chief mate, and informed me that a barge had come aboard. A lot of strange things happened in Colombo that night. I was about to order the petty officer to push her off and let her sail away, but the XO suggested that we first look to see if there was anything on her. So we did. On the barge, carefully covered with tarpaulins, were the Erlikons. Within half an hour 2 of them were hoisted aboard. Then the barge was pushed away, and soon we had nothing to do with it. We had only 2 chest drills at our disposal to drill additional holes in the deck. It was not an easy job, to say the least. It involved all the crew, including the officers. Each drilled for exactly 15 minutes. As a result, by morning both Erlikon were installed. A few strokes of paint, and no one could prove that they had not stood on that spot since the day they were built. Now we had to get ammunition for the unexpected spoils, and as the chief reported that steam was ready, we hoisted anchor and headed for the storehouse. There was still panic on shore, and no one paid much attention to our demand for more ammunition. We got everything we asked for, with the result that ammunition had to be stacked even in my cabin and under the table in the wardroom. Our new number 1 was in Singapore when the city fell. And if the reader wants to accuse us of stealing, he should first read the accounts of eyewitnesses and participants in the Singapore tragedy. Having used up every last round of ammunition, they were helpless, for they could not procure others, although there was no shortage of ammunition on shore. Riches was not going to allow a repetition of what had been done, especially when it was in his power to prevent it. The new XO was not like his predecessor. He had been in business in Singapore before the war, and was accustomed to the peculiarities of the East. He had been a lieutenant in the Singapore division of the KVDR, and was quite a competent servant. Besides, he was a true walker of reach. No one knew better than him where you had to go in the East to get what you needed. By the way, his understanding of how far you could go to get something you needed for your ship was much broader than mine. For example, he managed to get a real motorboat from the Bombay dock, but he used more than questionable means to do it. But a week or 2 later, he went over the top. I had always disliked the simple metal handrails on the gangways leading from the wardroom to the deck where my cabin was, and on to the upper deck. We tried to cover them with canvas, but there was too much up and down traffic on these gangways and the canvas would not hold. Having been at various bases, I often requested that wooden handrails be installed, but to no avail. At Bombay we were docked alongside the large destroyer Nubian. One evening I was on my way to my ship. As I passed the destroyer, the captain came on deck and kindly invited me to his cabin for a drink. In the course of our conversation we discussed many different problems and among others the horrible theft in the shipyard area. Damn it, Rayner, you have no idea what it's come to. As recently as tonight my XO left a new wooden gangway on the dock, in full view of the XO. So it was stolen, and our man swears that he didn't go anywhere, but he didn't notice how it happened and who the thief was. I expressed my sincere sympathy, as I should, for I knew well how hard it was to get something good for my ship in wartime. It was quite dark when I got on the Verbena as I passed the blackout. I put my hand on the rail, and instead of the usual cold of metal, felt the pleasant warmth of real wood. I lit a match so true, the handrail was wood. I looked at the next gangway. Back during tea time I know for a fact the handrails there had been metal. Now they were wooden too, and as I suspected, magic had nothing to do with it. The match burned out and burned my fingers painfully. Number 1. I shouted in the direction of his cabin. "Come out at once, you filthy thief." The grinning XO appeared in the dimly lit corridor. Number 1, I began ominously. "I take it this is all that's left of the Nubians' new gangways." "Aye, sir, there are some very irresponsible people on this ship. They leave good things on the dock and don't look after them." "Irresponsible or not, their captain's coming to see me tomorrow." "Wonderful, sir." His voice didn't sound like he was in a bad mood. He's never been here before. How will he know? Maybe he won't, but it'll be embarrassing. But you wouldn't understand. You're not familiar with such feelings. I think you ought to think about stopping, don't you? When I had finished this accusatory speech, I went proudly to my cabin, but curiosity got the better of me. "Can you at least tell me how you did it?" I gave the local Indians a packet of tobacco, and they took it without any trouble. Loaded them on a barge and brought them to our starboard side. You can't see it from the Nubian. An overzealous XO can be a real nightmare, but I can't help but recognize that this man did a lot of good for us. Despite his shortcomings, he was a first-class officer and was loved and respected by the men. At Colombo, our boilers were never cleaned. We put to sea again to take the convoy to Trincomalee, having 3,000 hours of boiler work. On the way back, we received a message: load 100 sheep and 100 goats for Adu Atoll. The XO read the order with great doubt, but I laughed merrily. Don't worry, number one. It's not about cattle. It's just a silly code. I think sheep are soldiers and goats are sailors. Although it could be the other way around, no one's going to turn us into Noah's Ark. But it was sheep and goats we were talking about. There were units of the Indian Army on the island. Being Mohammedans, they ate meat from freshly killed animals. Of course, we delivered the animals which were to be killed to their destination, but how we smelled is a separate story. 2 weeks later, we took the convoy to Karachi. It was a very large convoy, and another corvette, the Heliotrope, was given to help us. As we were passing Bombay, the chief engineer came up to the bridge. "I'm sorry, sir, but I had to put out one of the boilers. There's water oozing out the fire door." "What's the matter, Chief?" "Pipes." "I'm afraid so, sir." I immediately relayed a message to the Heliotrope: receive convoy due to serious boiler trouble. I'm forced to proceed to Bombay. We couldn't keep up with the convoy on one boiler. That's what not cleaning boilers in time and constant racing can lead to. We dragged ourselves all the way to Bombay. Manoeuvring to put the Verbena at the Navy Yard dock, I heard a call from the engine room. Chief informed me that the second boiler had flown too and he had to stop the machinery. 5 more minutes, I asked. "I'm afraid that's not possible, sir." "All right. Let's drop anchor." Bending over the rail, I shouted to the XO number 1, "We've dropped anchor." Chief put out the fire under the second kettle too. I never steered the Verbena again. The last 200 yards we were dragged along on a tug. Preliminary inspection showed that we needed to replace 864 pipes. It was not possible to manufacture them in India. We had to import them from home. The first batch was loaded on a ship torpedoed by a German submarine. To make a long story short, we arrived in Bombay in May and were still there in August. My adored Verbena had become an anti-aircraft ship, stationary at anchor off the Taj Mahal Hotel. The first thing I did was to do my best to make the men comfortable. 2/3 of the crew were in the rest camp and 1/3 on board. I, too, took every opportunity to relax. I was keenly exploring India, the exotic jungles south of Belgaum, the fantastic Mount Abu rising from the flat plain of Rajputana. And near the northwest border, I made a 200-mile journey on horseback through the Harboi Hills and visited the Khan in Kalat. There, since I happened to be the first naval officer to visit Kalat, I had to make a review of the entire Kalat State Army, which numbered 2,000 men. I arrived at the parade, having travelled 30 miles, riding a handsome Nesta stallion, dressed in a white ceremonial uniform that happened to be with me, surrounded by an honorary escort of tribal members on funny little ponies. It was all quite interesting, but this was not war. Mentally, I was in the North Atlantic escorting convoys, but nothing was heard of new tubes for the Verbena. The defeat inflicted on the Japanese by the American Navy off Midway Island in June 1942 had pushed back the looming threat of invasion from the sea over India. Japanese submarines were smaller than German submarines, and the morale of their crews was not at an all-time high. Kamikazes, which are many among Japanese pilots, were not in the submarine fleet. There could be no question of a general offensive in the Eastern Indian Ocean until the issue with Germany will not be resolved. Based on the above, it was quite clear to me that if I stayed here, the path to professional growth would be closed to me. I could only improve in my profession at home on the western approaches to our islands. I often complained of chest pains, which, strictly speaking, could have been caused by anything. Unable to pinpoint the exact cause, the doctors had long been anxious to send me home. I finally decided to let them do it. In early September 1942, I boarded a ship carrying troops. The ship docked in Liverpool just before Christmas. I spent the holidays with my family, after which I went to London to the Admiralty. Much to my surprise, I was asked if I could command a destroyer. With bated breath, I replied that I certainly could. An hour later, I walked out of the Admiralty, having been assigned to the S-class destroyer Shikari. I couldn't believe my good fortune. After all, I had become the first CWDR officer in naval history to be appointed to command a destroyer. I returned to Liverpool to pay a visit to the new Western Approaches Fleet Commander, Admiral Max Houghton. There were many of the most conflicting rumours about the new admiral. Some scolded him, others praised him. But whatever the case, the staff created by the admiral was extremely efficient and very effective. He knew how to select subordinates, was one of the most pleasant to communicate, charming people whom I have met, but at the same time could show unjustifiable cruelty to those who hindered him. Goya has a painting called The Grand Inquisitor, the character of which resembled our admiral. Somewhat later I learned of some of his weaknesses. He really loved fervently, sincerely, with all his heart, what he himself had given life to. This is the Northern Patrol Force, which he commanded from the beginning of the war until December 1939, the submarine fleet, the Western Approaches Fleet. These combat formations, which achieved outstanding success under his command, were to him both his beloved wife and adored children. When the last of them ceased to exist, this man could not live on. He outlived his last child by only 6 years. No one who saw him on the eve of his victory could have imagined that Admiral Max Houghton would last so little in the retirement he went into after the Western Approaches Fleet was disbanded. Max Houghton's accomplishments in the Western Approaches Fleet Group could be called unique, but the element of luck could not be denied. Admiral Houghton took command just at a time when many of the vital reforms initiated by his brilliant, though somewhat lesser-known predecessors were beginning to bear fruit. The Western Approaches Fleet was, even by the highest standards, surprisingly highly efficient. Admiral Sir Percy Noble, long before Max Houghton, had created a first-class organisation, and his predecessor, Admiral Dunbar Nasmyth, had started from nothing, and, in spite of difficulties, had built a solid foundation upon which a magnificent building was later erected. It is useless to speculate as to how things would have turned out if these 3 great officers had come to office in a different order. I venture to guess that the result would have been the same. Max Houghton I knew better than any of the others, for I had been too small a hand before. In the 15 months I had been away, there had been a noticeable change. The old escort group commanders had been replaced by new ones. Human flesh also has a limit to fatigue. Howard Johnston was promoted to captain and continued to work in the Admiralty. The new commander brought with him new officers, many of whom were, like him, former submariners. The tactical school he had established under Captain Roberts had already begun practicing general tactics against German submarines. At this stage of the war, they hunted in wolf packs and caused enormous damage if they made their way inside a convoy. I suppose Max Houghton's secret was simply this: he saw that teamwork in some groups produced excellent results, while others were far less effective. As a strong proponent of offensive action, he concluded that the secret to successful defense lay in offensive tactics. To be fair, the lack of modern ships, qualified officers and experienced crews did not allow Max Houghton's predecessors to switch from defense to offense, no matter how much they would have liked to do so. Max Houghton's main achievement was that he was able to use his tactical school to combine the best of each group's tactics, and from this to create instructions for convoys which served faithfully for many years. Having thus protected his convoys, he took the next step and set about destroying the enemy by creating support groups from the new ships under construction, which performed admirably. The culmination of the success may be considered the action of the group under the command of the most distinguished of all escort commanders, Captain F.J.Y. Walker. I paid a visit to Admiral Houghton. He told me that the Shikari was under repair in Belfast, and that I was to undergo tactical training and assume command in exactly 1 month. In addition, he said that he was assembling all the S-class destroyers into one fast-moving group. Naturally, the message interested me. I wanted to know who would be the senior officer. I did not have time to ask a question, because the conversation was interrupted by the appearance of an officer of the fleet of Free France. He brought a map, which the Admiral looked at in silence for some time. When the officer left, the Admiral turned to me. "Rayner, did this man have a gun in his pocket?" "Yes, sir. He apparently doesn't know the difference between a French admiral and a British admiral." The conversation went on for quite a while. I realized that the Admiral wanted to form a more definite opinion of me, but I could not understand why he devoted so much time to me. Everything was explained when I was about to leave. When I got up from my chair, the Admiral asked, "Rayner, do you realize that you will be the senior officer of the 21st Escort Group?" To say that I left shaken. unable to feel my feet under me, is to minimize the truth. What I heard was like a fairy tale and beyond my wildest dreams. I would have not just one S-class destroyer, but 6. In my mind, I already saw them 6 proud beauties, from under the graceful forefronts of which are scattered foamy waves. I envisioned them following in a keelboat formation and board to board. In either form, the sight was marvelous. Daydreaming, I fell down the stairs and was brought to my feet by a surprised female women's auxiliary officer. She must have thought I was drunk,